In 1957, Albert Anastasia, the most feared executioner in Mafia history, murdered 3 of Bumpy Johnson's men in cold blood. No warning, no negotiation, just bodies. But 6 months later, it was Anastasia bleeding out in a barber chair. Not Bumpy. How does a Harlem boss destroy the man no one dared to touch? The hot towel hit Albert Anastasia's face with the weight of finality. Steam curling up past his ears like something trying to escape. The barber's scissors whispered through hair that cost more to cut than most men earned in a week. Chrome gleamed under fluorescent lights. The leather chair creaked as Anastasia settled deeper, shoulders dropping, jaw loosening. The small surrenders a man makes when he believes he's untouchable. Then shoes on tile. Hard soles. Multiple pairs. The kind of footsteps that don't pause to ask directions. The first shot punched through the morning quiet like a fist through wet paper. Then another. Then the sound stopped being individual and became a roar. A mechanical thunder that turned the air itself into something you could choke on. The barber's mirror spiderwebbed. Glass rained down in pieces small enough to catch the light. The chair spun. Lazy. Almost gentle. The way a compass needle drifts when it's lost magnetic north. Anastasia's hand slipped off the armrest. Fingers still curled like they were holding something they'd never let go. The towel stayed white for exactly 3 seconds. Then it didn't. No screaming. No running. Just the lingering smell of cordite mixing with bay rum and the particular emptiness that follows violence when nobody's left to argue about what happened. The shooters walked out the same door they'd walked in. Same pace. Same certainty. And somewhere 300 miles south. In a room that smelled like sawdust and last night's whiskey. Bumpy Johnson sat with his hands folded. Not smiling. Not speaking, because men who understand how power actually transfers don't waste time on celebration. This was October 23rd, 1957. And what you're about to hear isn't speculation or legend or the kind of story that gets better with each telling. This is what happened when one man decided fear was currency, and another man decided to bankrupt him, using nothing but patience and information that moved through the underworld. Like blood through a body, nobody bothered to examine until it stopped flowing. Albert Anastasia didn't just kill people. He killed the idea of resistance. That was the product. Murder Incorporated wasn't a crew. It was a philosophy made flesh. When Anastasia sent men to do a job, they did it with the efficiency of factory workers. The same motion repeated until the clock said quitting time. No mess, no drama, just the work. And then the absence where a person used to be. He had a face like carved stone, left out in the rain too long. Deep lines, eyes that didn't blink as often as they should. When he entered a room, men found reasons to check their watches, adjust their ties, look anywhere except directly at him. Because direct eye contact felt like a challenge, and challenges had consequences that involved closed caskets and grieving widows who knew better than to ask questions. Meyer Lansky understood numbers the way priests understand scripture. He could look at a column of figures and see the future, predict who'd be broke by Tuesday and who'd be breathing by Thursday. He wore glasses that caught the light when he tilted his head, making his eyes disappear behind twin circles of glare. And maybe that was intentional, because a man who controls that much money doesn't need people reading his expressions. Lucky Luciano had built the modern Mafia the way an architect builds a cathedral, not with passion, but with precision. He'd taken the old ways, the blood feuds and ethnic territories, and replaced them with something colder and infinitely more durable. Structure, rules, a hierarchy where everyone knew their place and stayed there or got reminded why staying put was the smart play. He spoke quietly, which meant everyone leaned in to listen, which meant he never had to repeat himself. Stephanie Saint. Claire ran Harlem's numbers racket with an accountant's mind and a general's instincts. She'd carved out territory in a neighborhood most white folks only saw through car windows. They kept rolled up tight. She knew every corner, every counting house, every runner who moved money through streets that smelled like frying fish and wet concrete, and dreams deferred so long they'd calcified into something harder than hope. That was the landscape. Predators circling, territories drawn and redrawn when the drawing got messy. Anastasia started squeezing Harlem the way you squeeze a lemon. Slow pressure, waiting for the juice. His men showed up at counting houses with suggestions that sounded like requests, but functioned like ultimatums. They smiled while they talked, teeth showing, eyes dead. The kind of smile that makes your stomach drop because you know what's behind it, what it's covering up, what it promises if you're stupid enough to say no. Protection, they called it. As if the thing you needed protection from wasn't standing right there in your doorway, blocking the light. Bumpy Johnson didn't flinch, didn't posture, didn't make threats he'd have to back up in ways that would bring attention nobody needed. He sat in rooms thick with cigar smoke and listened to men who wanted action. Who needed action? Who thought action was the only language power understood? And he said nothing, just watched, just waited, just collected information like other men collected stamps, patient and methodical and utterly without visible emotion. Then one of his men vanished, clean, no body, no explanation, just an empty chair at the morning count. A corner left unworked, a space in the machinery that used to be filled with a living, breathing human being who had a name and a family and debts he'd never finish paying. No declaration of war, just the message, delivered in absence. The old men talked. They always talked. Said Bumpy had to respond, had to hit back, had to show strength or lose everything. They spoke with the certainty of men who'd never built anything worth losing. Men whose advice came cheap because nobody was paying for it anymore. But Bumpy understood something they didn't. Real power doesn't shout. It whispers. And if you listen close enough, you can hear it breathing in the spaces between what people say and what they mean. The air inside the counting house hung thick enough to chew. Cigarette smoke layered itself in horizontal planes that shifted when men moved, revealing and concealing faces in rotation. Cash sat in stacks on tables that had seen better decades, rubber-banded tight, sorted by denomination. The paper wearing that particular smell of having passed through too many hands in too short a time. Sweat mixed with tobacco and something else, something metallic. The scent of men doing math in their heads while watching the door because the door was always worth watching. Harlem didn't sleep. It calculated. Every corner, every stoop, every window with a light still burning at 3 in the morning represented a transaction in progress or a debt coming due. The neighborhood breathed in rhythm with money changing hands, a pulse you could feel if you stood still long enough, if you knew what you were listening for. Murder Incorporated sent observers. That's what they called them. Observers. Men in clean suits who showed up offering assistance, using words like cooperation and mutual benefit. Their voices smooth as oil on water, and twice as likely to catch fire if you introduced the wrong spark. They positioned themselves near the counting tables, not touching anything, just watching. Their presence alone a kind of pressure, a weight that made the room feel smaller and the air harder to breathe. Bumpy restructured everything. Didn't announce it. Didn't hold meetings. Just started moving pieces on a board nobody else could see. He split the money flow into streams so thin you couldn't trace them back to a source. Changed collection times daily. rotated counting houses on schedules that followed no pattern except the one in his head. No single person knew the complete system anymore. Not his lieutenants, not his collectors, not even the men who'd been with him since the beginning. Back when loyalty meant something because survival depended on it, information became compartmentalized. You knew your piece, your corner, your responsibility. And that was all you knew, because knowing more made you valuable to people who'd pay for information with your continued breathing. And Bumpy had seen too many men trade their lives for temporary safety that lasted exactly as long as their usefulness. Then someone talked. Not because they wanted to, because fear has its own gravity. Pulls words out of mouths that should have stayed closed. One of the collectors, a man named Davis who'd been solid for years, who had kids and a mortgage and all the anchors that should have kept him steady. He mentioned schedules to the wrong person in a bar that smelled like spilled beer and poor decisions. Just mentioned them. Casual. Trying to sound important. Trying to push back against the weight of knowing that men in clean suits were asking questions about him specifically. About his family. About where his kids went to school and what time his wife walked home from work. The words left his mouth and entered the ecosystem and became information that moved through channels invisible to anyone who wasn't paying attention. But Bumpy was always paying attention. That was the job. That was the only job that mattered. Davis disappeared on a Tuesday. Not violently. He just stopped showing up. His corner went dark. His collections didn't happen. And the message rippled outward like a stone dropped in still water, spreading in concentric circles that touched every man who handled money. Every man who knew schedules. Every man who might be tempted to trade information for the illusion of safety. The counting house stayed quiet for 3 days. Men came in, did their work, left without the usual conversation. The usual complaints about territory or percentages or who was shorting who. Just silence. The heavy kind. The kind that sits on your chest and makes breathing deliberate. Bumpy walked through one evening when the light outside had gone amber, that particular October color that makes everything look like it's already a memory. He didn't say anything, didn't need to, just moved between the tables, hands in his pockets, eyes taking inventory, not of the money but of the men counting it, reading their faces the way accountants read ledgers, looking for discrepancies, for numbers that didn't balance. Fear. He understood. Killed more men than bullets ever would. Fear made you stupid. Made you talk when silence would save you. Made you run when standing still was the only move that wouldn't get you noticed. And in this world, being noticed by the wrong people was the same as signing your own ending and asking someone else to notarize it. Which is exactly what happened to men who forgot that silence was the most expensive currency they'd ever spend. One of the old-timers, a man named Sullivan, who'd been running numbers since before Bumpy was born. He caught Bumpy's eye across the smoke and the stacked currency. "They're tightening," Sullivan said. Not a question, just an observation from someone who'd lived long enough to recognize patterns. Bumpy nodded once. Slow. Let them. And that was all. 2 words. But Sullivan understood. When someone squeezes, they're committed to the squeeze. They can't let go without losing face. And men who care that much about face make predictable mistakes. Because pride is just fear wearing a different coat. And fear makes you blind to the moment when the trap you're building becomes the one you're standing in. 3 empty chairs. That's how October became November. Not with explosions or headlines or police tape stretched across doorways. Just absences. Spaces in the machinery where men used to be. Where their voices used to fill rooms and their hands used to count money. And their presence used to mean something to someone. First was Coleman. He ran the uptown collections, had done it for 6 years without a single dollar going missing, which in this business was the equivalent of sainthood. He left his apartment one morning and never arrived at his first pickup. His car stayed parked on the street. His coffee sat on his kitchen table, still warm when his wife found it 3 hours later. The cup ringed with lipstick from where she'd drunk from it earlier, a detail she'd remember for the rest of her life because memory works that way. Holds on to the small things when the large things become unbearable. Second was price. Downtown territory. He'd been arguing with Anastasia's people about percentages, about how much Harlem owed for protection it hadn't asked for and didn't need. Arguing wasn't wrong. Bumpy argued. Lansky argued. Even Luciano argued when the numbers didn't make sense. But Price argued loud, made it personal, turned a business discussion into a masculinity contest, and masculinity contests only have one winner. And it's never the man who needs to prove something. They found his hat 2 blocks from his last known location. Just the hat, floating in a gutter filled with October rain and cigarette butts and the kind of urban debris that nobody bothers to name. The hat stayed there for 3 days before someone picked it up, looked at it, recognized it, and dropped it back in the water like it was hot. Third was Williams. He'd been with Bumpy longest, 10 years. Long enough to be trusted. Long enough to know things. Long enough to become valuable to people who trafficked in information and paid for it with temporary immunity from consequences. Nobody knows if Williams talked. Nobody knows if he was even approached. But he went to buy cigarettes and never came back. And the store owner remembered him leaving with a pack of Lucky Strikes and nothing else, stepping out into afternoon light that turned everything the color of old brass. 3 men, 3 holes in the structure. Anastasia wasn't hitting the organization. He was dissecting it, removing components one at a time, watching what broke, what compensated, what revealed itself when stress got applied to the right pressure points. Bumpy didn't retaliate, didn't send bodies to balance the equation. Instead, he started making phone calls. Not many, not obvious, just quiet conversations with people who understood that information moved both ways, that debts accumulated in ledgers nobody ever saw but everyone felt. He reached out to Meyer Lansky's people. Not directly, never directly, through intermediaries who spoke the language of finance and probability, who could frame Harlem's situation not as a turf war but as a market inefficiency, a problem that affected profit margins across multiple territories, a situation that would spread if left untreated because Anastasia didn't understand the first rule of making money in their world, which was that you make it quietly or you don't make it for long. And the federal government was always watching for exactly the kind of noise Anastasia was making. The meeting happened in a restaurant nobody remembers the name of anymore, in a back room that smelled like garlic and old carpet. Bumpy sat across from a man whose name doesn't matter because he wasn't there as himself. He was there as Lansky's eyes and ears, his capacity to absorb information and carry it back without interpretation or editorializing. Anastasia's making noise, Bumpy said. He didn't elaborate, didn't need to. In their world, noise was the unforgivable sin, the thing that brought federal attention and grand juries and photographers who made careers out of catching criminals in unflattering light. The man across from him nodded, sipped water from a glass that had fingerprints on it. People are noticing. They should. That was the conversation. 4 sentences. 5 if you counted the nod. But it was enough. Information entered circulation, not as accusation, not as warning, just as observation, the kind that lets men in positions of authority draw their own conclusions and take their own actions while maintaining the fiction that nobody told them to do anything. Bumpy understood what the old-timers didn't. You don't survive by being the strongest. You survive by making stronger people believe you're useful. You become the information they need, the perspective they lack, the early warning system that keeps them rich and breathing and out of courtrooms where photographers wait with flashbulbs ready. And if those stronger people decide someone else is the problem, well, that's just the natural order reasserting itself. That's just what happens when a man forgets that the structure they'd built together depended on silence, on invisibility, on making money without making headlines. Anastasia was making headlines, not yet in newspapers, but in conversations, in phone calls, in quiet assessments made by men who calculated risk the way engineers calculated load-bearing weight. 3 empty chairs in Harlem. But the chair that mattered most was in a barber shop in Manhattan, and it wouldn't stay occupied much longer. No gunfire, no raised voices, just a room in lower Manhattan where the walls were thick enough that sound didn't travel, and men could speak truths that would get them killed if spoken anywhere else. The table was mahogany, older than most of the men sitting around it, polished to a shine that caught reflections, without clarity, turning faces into suggestions rather than certainties. Meyer Lansky sat at one end, glasses perched on his nose, a ledger open in front of him that he wasn't reading because the numbers he cared about weren't written down anywhere. Lucky Luciano occupied the opposite end, smoking a cigarette that had gone out twice already, relighting it with the kind of patience that suggested he had nowhere else to be and all the time in the world to get there. Between them sat representatives from families whose names you knew if you read newspapers and whose operations you funded if you paid taxes. Because the line between legitimate business and organized crime was drawn in pencil and erased whenever convenient. These were men who'd built empires on the principle that money made quietly was money you got to keep. And money made loudly was money that brought federal agents with subpoenas and cameras. "Anastasia's a problem," Lansky said, not to anyone specific, just into the room, letting the words settle like dust. Nobody disagreed. Disagreement required evidence to the contrary, and the evidence was mounting in ways that made accountants nervous and lawyers expensive. Anastasia was pressing Harlem. Yes, but that wasn't the issue. The issue was how he was pressing. Loud, visible, leaving bodies in places where bodies attracted attention, asking questions that made people ask other questions, creating ripples that turned into waves that federal prosecutors could ride all the way to indictments. "He's making us all visible," Luciano added. The cigarette dangled from his lips, smoke curling up past his eyes. That's the problem. The unwritten law of their world was simple. Make money. Don't make noise. The two were inversely proportional. The more noise you made, the less money you kept, because noise brought scrutiny, and scrutiny brought consequences that no amount of money could buy your way out of. Not when senators needed headlines, and prosecutors needed convictions, and the public needed someone to blame for the fact that their neighborhoods weren't as safe as they pretended to remember them being. Bumpy Johnson wasn't in that room, would never be invited into that room, but his information was there, carried by intermediaries who'd carried it through channels specifically designed to obscure origin, presented as observation rather than accusation, framed as concern for collective well-being rather than personal grievance. The men around the table understood what was happening without needing it explained. Anastasia was violating the fundamental rule. He was conducting business like it was 1927 instead of 1957. Like prohibition was still in effect and violence was still romantic and the federal government was still looking the other way because bootlegging kept the tax revenue flowing and the voters drinking. But this wasn't 1927. This was a different world. A world where the FBI had resources and wiretaps and agents who didn't take bribes because they made enough money legally and believed in what they were doing with the kind of fervor that made them dangerous. A world where organized crime had survived by becoming organized, by following rules, by understanding that the structure Luciano had built only worked if everyone respected it. Anastasia wasn't respecting it. Anastasia was treating the structure like a suggestion. And suggestions were for people who didn't understand that rules kept everyone alive and rich and out of courtrooms. "How long?" someone asked. The voice came from the middle of the table, belonging to a man whose face the history books wouldn't remember, but whose decisions shaped outcomes that historians would spend decades trying to explain. Lansky closed his ledger. The sound of the cover meeting the pages was soft but final. "Until he costs us more than he makes us." That was the calculus. Pure. Simple. Devoid of sentiment or loyalty, or any of the things people pretended. Motivated decisions in the underworld, but which actually just got you killed by people who understood that sentiment was a luxury, and loyalty was a transaction, and business was business regardless of how many bodies you'd buried together. Bumpy had understood this from the beginning, had understood that he didn't need to beat Anastasia, didn't need to match him body for body or territory for territory. He just needed to make Anastasia a liability, make him expensive, make him the kind of problem that men in mahogany rooms solved with phone calls instead of confrontation. The meeting lasted another hour. Decisions were made in the language of implication and inference, the kind of conversation where nobody said anything actionable but everyone left understanding exactly what needed to happen and who was responsible for making it happen. This was how empires functioned when they reached a certain size, when direct orders became evidence and plausible deniability became the most valuable currency anyone possessed. Anastasia didn't know about that meeting, wouldn't know until it was too late. Because the thing about intelligence isn't that it wins fights, it's that intelligence makes violence commit suicide, makes power turn on itself, makes the strong eliminate their own strength because they've been convinced it's the smart play. And somewhere in Harlem, Bumpy Johnson sat in a room that smelled like yesterday's cigars and waited for information to do what bullets never could. He wasn't the victim. He was the conductor. And the symphony was just reaching its crescendo. Information moved through the underworld the way water moved through pipes. You couldn't see it, couldn't track it, but you could measure its effects by watching what happened downstream, by noting which faucets ran dry and which ones kept flowing, by understanding that pressure applied in one location created consequences 3 connections removed. Bumpy started talking, not to anyone important, not to anyone whose name would appear in a file or on a wiretap. He talked to people who talked to other people who talked to people who mattered, creating a chain so long and so convoluted that by the time information reached its destination, nobody could trace it back to its source without interviewing half of New York and most of New Jersey. He mentioned things, casual observations, the kind of details that seemed insignificant in isolation, but became patterns when assembled. Like puzzle pieces that didn't make sense until you stepped back and saw the complete picture. He mentioned that Anastasia's collections were attracting attention, that beat cops were asking questions, that federal agents had been seen taking photographs outside counting houses that happened to be under new management. None of it was accusation, all of it was fact. And facts, delivered to the right people in the right context, were more dangerous than lies because facts couldn't be disputed, only interpreted, and interpretation depended on who was doing the interpreting and what they stood to lose if they interpreted incorrectly. The information reached Meyer Lansky through a lawyer who represented interests that occasionally aligned with Lansky's interests. Delivered over lunch in a restaurant where the tables were far enough apart that conversations stayed private, and the waiters had been working there long enough to know when not to refill water glasses. "There's talk," the lawyer said. He didn't specify what kind of talk or who was doing the talking. Didn't need to. In their world, talk was a category that included everything from rumors to indictments, and the smart money was always on assuming the worst and working backward from there. Lansky cut his steak with the precision of a surgeon. Thin slices, even thickness. What kind of talk? The federal kind. That was enough. Federal talk meant investigations. Investigations meant subpoenas. Subpoenas meant testimony. Testimony meant exposure. Exposure meant the kind of trials that made front-page news and turned anonymous criminals into household names. Which was exactly the opposite of what men like Lansky needed if they wanted to keep making money and avoiding prison. The information reached Lucky Luciano through different channels, but with the same message. Anastasia was hot, not in the sense of being wanted by police. Everyone was wanted by police, but in the sense of generating heat, attracting attention, creating the conditions where federal resources got allocated and task forces got formed and prosecutors started building cases that could make careers. Luciano and Lansky didn't meet to discuss it. Didn't need to. They'd built the modern Mafia together, had established the rules that everyone operated under, understood without needing to articulate that those rules existed for a reason, and that reason was survival. When someone violated the rules badly enough and consistently enough, the system corrected itself, not through emotion, not through revenge, just through the cold mathematics of cost-benefit analysis. "He's a liability," Lansky said during a phone call that happened late on a Tuesday, his voice flat, stating fact without embellishment. "He is," Luciano agreed. The line crackled with distance and poor connection and the particular static that came from assuming the FBI was listening, because the FBI was always listening. Someone should mention that to him. Someone should... The conversation lasted 3 minutes. No names were used. No actions were specified. But information had been exchanged and decisions had been made, and the machinery that enforced those decisions was already moving. Invisible and inevitable. Like gravity or time or any other force that operates without needing permission or providing warning. Bumpy never signed his name to any of it, never appeared in any room where decisions were made or strategies were discussed. He was a source without attribution, a voice without identity. The person who'd provided the match but hadn't struck it. And in the underworld, that distinction was the difference between being thanked and being eliminated. Information was currency, the only kind that appreciated over time instead of depreciating, the only kind that could be spent repeatedly without losing value, the only kind that worked in darkness better than it worked in light, because light meant exposure, and exposure meant everyone could see where the information came from and who benefited from its distribution. In darkness, information moved freely, connected dots that seemed unrelated, revealed patterns that suggested solutions, made powerful men believe that their decisions were their own when really they were just responding to stimuli that had been carefully arranged by someone who understood that the person asking the question usually controlled the answer. And the question now, in rooms Bumpy would never enter, among men whose power exceeded his, but whose information didn't, was simple. What do we do about Anastasia? The answer was forming. Slow but certain, because in their world, there was only ever one answer to men who couldn't follow rules, who couldn't be quiet, who couldn't understand that survival depended on invisibility, and invisibility required discipline that Anastasia had never possessed. And never would. Anastasia felt it before he understood it. A shifting in the atmosphere. Nothing concrete. Nothing you could point to and say there. That's the problem. Just a sense that the world had tilted slightly. That gravity pulled differently. That the rules he'd operated under for 30 years had changed without announcement or explanation. Phone calls came less frequently. Invitations to meetings dried up. People who used to seek his counsel started making decisions without consulting him. And when he asked about it, they smiled and said everything was fine, and he knew they were lying because in his business, everyone was always lying. The only question was what they were lying about and why. He started looking at Harlem harder. Started thinking that maybe Bumpy Johnson was more than just a local operator, that maybe there was coordination happening that he couldn't see, connections being made behind his back, alliances forming in shadows he couldn't penetrate because he'd spent too long relying on fear instead of information. Fear was blunt. Information was surgical. And Anastasia was learning, too late, that the world had moved on from blunt instruments. He sent more men into Harlem, pushed harder, asked more questions, applied more pressure. Did everything that instinct and experience told him to do when someone was challenging your authority. Which was exactly the wrong response because it made him more visible, more exposed, more of the liability that Lansky and Luciano had already identified him as being. Bumpy did nothing, said nothing, maintained the silence that had become his signature, the absence of reaction that was itself a kind of response, the refusal to engage that made Anastasia's aggression look disproportionate and irrational, and exactly the kind of behavior that men in positions of real authority didn't tolerate because it threatened the stability they'd worked decades to establish. In a room, nobody will tell you the location of a decision was made, not voted on, not debated at length, just acknowledged as inevitable by men who'd seen this pattern before, who understood that organizations either enforced their rules or became subject to everyone else's rules. And being subject to everyone else's rules meant federal indictments and prison sentences and the kind of public trials that destroyed everything they'd built. He can't adapt, someone said. The voice belonged to a man who'd known Anastasia for 20 years, who'd worked with him and profited from him, and who now spoke about him with the detachment of a doctor discussing a patient whose prognosis was terminal. He won't, Lansky corrected. That's worse. Won't implied choice. Implied that Anastasia had been given opportunities to change, to adjust, to understand that the world had evolved and he needed to evolve with it, and he'd refused. Not out of principle, but out of pride, which was just another word for ego, and ego was the thing that got more men killed than bullets ever would. The decision, once made, became operational. Names were mentioned. Responsibilities were assigned. Timelines were established. All of it happening in language so coded and indirect that if someone had recorded the conversation and played it back in court, no jury would convict because nothing specific was ever said. Just implications and suggestions and the kind of conversation that powerful men have when they need something done but can't afford to be connected to the doing of it. Anastasia felt the circle tightening but misread what it meant. Thought it was about territory, about money, about the usual competitions that defined their world. He didn't understand that it wasn't personal, wasn't about him specifically, was about what he represented, which was chaos in a system that required order, noise in an organization that depended on silence, exposure in a structure built entirely on staying invisible. He made the mistake of thinking he was indispensable, that Murder Incorporated needed him, that his reputation provided protection. And maybe once upon a time it had. But reputations depreciate when they become liabilities. And his reputation had stopped being useful the moment it started attracting federal attention. Bumpy watched from Harlem, received updates through channels that reported facts without interpretation, learned that Anastasia was isolated, that support had evaporated, that the decision had been made and now it was just a question of timing and location, and who would be trusted to handle the mechanics. He didn't celebrate, didn't relax, just waited, because the thing about violence in their world was that it solved immediate problems, but created long-term consequences. And the smart move was always to wait until the consequences revealed themselves before deciding whether the problem had actually been solved or just relocated. October moved toward its end. The weather turned, leaves fell, and in barbershops across Manhattan, Men sat in chairs and trusted strangers with razors near their throats, which was either the ultimate expression of confidence or the ultimate expression of stupidity, depending on whether the stranger had been paid to cut your hair or paid to cut something else entirely. The person who loses control of their emotions loses control of their empire. Anastasia had lost control of both, and the machinery that enforced consequences for that kind of loss was already in motion, patient and inevitable, counting down to a moment that would arrive whether he was ready for it or not. October 25th, 1957, Manhattan. The Park Sheraton Hotel barbershop opened at 9 in the morning like it did every morning. The barber unlocking the door and flipping the sign and arranging his tools with the kind of muscle memory that comes from doing the same thing for 20 years in the same place with the same routine. Albert Anastasia arrived at 10:17, walked through the lobby without looking at anyone, without acknowledging the doorman or the desk clerk or the other guests who recognized him and found reasons to study the floor. He moved with the confidence of a man who'd spent decades making other people nervous, who'd forgotten what it felt like to be the one who should be watching the door. The barber chair was leather and chrome, installed when the hotel was new and the neighborhood was different, and America still believed that progress meant something other than increased federal surveillance and wiretaps that could pick up conversations through walls. Anastasia settled into it the way he'd settled into 100 chairs in 100 barber shops, shoulders relaxing, eyes closing, surrendering to the ritual of hot towels and sharp razors and the small vanities that powerful men indulge when they believe themselves untouchable. The hot towel went on at 10:21. Steam rose. The barber's scissors made their methodical cuts. Anastasia's breathing slowed. His hands uncurled. His jaw loosened. And then footsteps, hard soles on tile. The particular sound of men who'd made a decision and were executing it with the precision of a surgical procedure. The first shot came at 10:24. Then more. The sequence happened so fast that witnesses would later disagree about how many shots were fired, how many men did the firing, whether anyone said anything or if it all happened in silence. The mirror fractured. Glass fell. The chair spun slowly, losing momentum, coming to rest, facing away from the door. The shooters walked out. Same pace they'd walked in. No running. No panic. Just the kind of calm that comes from knowing exactly what you're doing and having done it enough times that emotion doesn't enter the equation. They got into a car that was already running, already pointed in the right direction, driven by someone who understood that timing mattered more than speed. The barber stood against the wall, hands raised, scissors still in his grip, his face the color of old newspaper. He'd seen what happened, would spend the rest of his life seeing it, would tell the story to police and grand juries and reporters and eventually to his grandchildren. Though the version he told his grandchildren would leave out the parts that made him wake up sweating at 3 in the morning for the next 2 decades. News traveled fast in their world, faster than police reports, faster than newspaper headlines, the kind of information that moved through phone calls made from booths and messages delivered by people who knew better than to write anything down. By noon, everyone who needed to know knew. By evening, the newspapers had it. By the next morning, America was reading about it over coffee and eggs, absorbing the details the way people absorb celebrity gossip, with fascination and distance and the comfortable certainty that violence like that happened to other people in other worlds. Meyer Lansky heard about it in Miami, hung up the phone, went back to his breakfast, toast and coffee. The toast had gone cold, but he ate it anyway because wasting food was wasteful, and waste indicated poor discipline. Lucky Luciano heard about it in Italy, made a phone call, said 3 words. "It's done then," hung up, poured himself wine from a bottle that cost more than most men earned in a month, and sat on a terrace that overlooked the Mediterranean. watching boats move across water that had been there before Rome and would be there after whatever came next. Bumpy Johnson heard about it in Harlem. Sat in the same chair he'd been sitting in for weeks, in the same room that smelled like old wood and older patience. Someone brought him the news. He nodded once, said nothing, because men who understand how power actually works don't confuse outcomes with participation. Don't claim credit for things that happen because the system corrected itself the way systems do when someone violates the rules badly enough and consistently enough. When order decides to eliminate a problem, you don't hear the gunshots. You just notice the absence, the empty chair, the quiet that follows when someone who made too much noise finally stops making any. This is what people who weren't there will never understand. What the official reports and the historical accounts will get wrong, because they'll look for conspiracy and coordination when really it was just mathematics. Just cost-benefit analysis, just the cold logic of organizations that survive by enforcing rules on people who thought they were above them. Anastasia was gone, not as punishment, not as revenge, just as correction. The way you correct a mistake in accounting, the way you remove a part that's causing the machine to malfunction. Efficient, necessary, already forgotten by the people who'd made it necessary. And in Harlem, life continued. The numbers ran. The money moved. The streets breathed their rhythm. Because the thing about violence in that world was that it was never personal, never emotional, never about anything except maintaining the structure that let everyone keep making money and avoiding prison. And the structure had just performed maintenance on itself. Harlem didn't celebrate. Didn't pour champagne or throw parties or gather in rooms to congratulate itself on survival. It adjusted, recalibrated, shifted weight from one foot to the other, the way you do when you've been standing too long and need to redistribute pressure before something goes numb. Bumpy sat across from Meyer Lansky's representative in a restaurant that served food nobody ate because the food wasn't why you came there. The representative was a lawyer named Cohen who wore suits that cost what factory workers made in 6 months and spoke with the precision of someone who understood that every word was potentially evidence in a trial that hadn't been scheduled yet. The percentages need revision, Cohen said. He had a notebook open but wasn't writing anything down. The notebook was a prop. Everything that mattered was already in his head, already calculated. Already approved by people who wouldn't be in this room, or any room where their presence could be documented. Bumpy nodded. What's fair? Fair is what keeps everyone working. You run Harlem. You know the streets. You know the people. That has value. What kind of value? Cohen named a number, a percentage, the kind of split that recognized reality, that acknowledged Bumpy controlled the ground, and the ground mattered because without it the whole structure was theoretical. Just numbers on paper that represented money nobody could actually collect. The negotiation took an hour, not because anyone disagreed, but because these things required time, required the appearance of consideration, required both sides to feel like they'd extracted concessions even when the outcome had been determined before anyone sat down. This was theater, professional, necessary, the kind of performance that let everyone save face while accepting terms that had been decided in rooms neither of them would ever enter. The families from before, Bumpy said, meaning Coleman's family, Price's family, Williams's family, the widows and children who'd lost providers because Anastasia had been teaching lessons, and the lessons had required bodies. Cohen closed his notebook. Taken care of. Envelopes went out yesterday. Ongoing support approved. Kids' education's funded. No public announcement. Good. And it was good. Not because anyone involved was benevolent or kind, or motivated by anything except enlightened self-interest, but because organizations that took care of their people's families attracted loyalty. And loyalty was cheaper than fear, and lasted longer, and didn't generate the kind of resentment that turned into testimony when federal prosecutors offered deals. The new order established itself without proclamation or ceremony. Lansky's people controlled the framework, set the rules, managed the money that moved between territories and cities and legitimate businesses that needed washing. Bumpy controlled Harlem, the operations, the daily mechanics of running numbers and collections and ensuring that the machine worked smoothly enough that nobody outside the neighborhood noticed it working at all. This was the model that would survive. Not because it was fair, but because it was functional. Not because everyone was happy, but because everyone was getting paid. Not because there was trust, but because there was structure. And structure provided predictability. And predictability let you plan further than next week. Let you build something that lasted longer than your lifespan. Let you create institutions instead of just territories that would get fought over the moment you stopped being strong enough to hold them. Harlem adjusted. New faces appeared in old positions. New runners learned routes that old runners had walked. New counters learned systems that had been refined over years of trial and error, and federal raids that taught you what worked and what attracted attention. The money kept moving. The percentages got calculated. The envelopes got delivered. And if you didn't know that anything had changed, you wouldn't notice that it had, because the surface stayed smooth even when everything underneath had been restructured. Stephanie Saint. Claire withdrew. Not completely. Not publicly. Just stepped back from day-to-day operations and let younger people handle the street-level work while she kept her hand in the parts that mattered. The strategic decisions, the relationships with suppliers and politicians and police captains who understood that cooperation was more profitable than confrontation. She'd built an empire, had proven that a woman could run numbers as well as any man and better than most. And now she was transitioning from operator to advisor. From the person in the ring to the person in the corner. From the one taking risks to the one calculating whether risks were worth taking. This was victory. Not the kind that got celebrated with ticker tape parades or medals or public recognition. Just the kind where you were still standing when everything settled. Still operating. Still relevant. Still taking a percentage of money that flowed through channels you'd helped dig and maintain and defend against people who thought force was sufficient when really force was just the least sophisticated tool in a box that included patience and information and the ability to make powerful people believe your survival served their interests. Bumpy understood this, had always understood it, had built his reputation not on being the toughest but on being the smartest. On knowing when to push and when to wait, on recognizing that real power wasn't about domination, but about positioning, about being the person who connected other people, who facilitated flows, who made himself indispensable not through fear, but through function. He walked Harlem streets the way he always had, hands in pockets, eyes noting everything. The corner boys who worked for him, the shop owners who paid him, the residents who nodded respect, not because they were afraid, but because he'd kept the neighborhood stable when stability was rare, had maintained order when order was valuable, had ensured that the violence that defined their world happened somewhere else to someone else. Victory wasn't eliminating your opponent. Victory was still being here when your opponent wasn't. Still operating, still relevant, still drawing breath in a world where breath was a privilege that could be revoked by people who decided you'd become more expensive than useful. Bumpy Johnson died in 1968. Not violently, not dramatically. Just stopped breathing one day in July. His heart deciding it had beaten enough times and was finished with the work. He was 62. Had outlived most of the men he'd started with. Had seen empires rise and fall and rise again under different management with different rules but the same fundamental logic. The funeral was well attended. People came who hadn't been to Harlem in years. People who remembered when Bumpy was young and hungry and dangerous. People who'd worked for him and with him and occasionally against him. Back when against him was still a survivable position. They filled the church, stood in the street, paid respects to a man who'd navigated a world where navigation required skills most people never developed, because developing them meant accepting that normal rules didn't apply. And normal morality was a luxury you couldn't afford. Anastasia had been gone 11 years by then. Remembered mostly in history books and true crime documentaries, and the kind of conversations old men had when they wanted to remind younger men that the past was more dangerous than the present, and survival meant something different when the people trying to kill you were professionals who'd been killing people since before you were born. Meyer Lansky was still alive, still operating, still managing money that flowed through channels so complex that federal investigators, with subpoena power and unlimited budgets, couldn't trace it all. Could only follow pieces of it before the trail disappeared into legitimate businesses and offshore accounts and legal structures designed by lawyers who charged by the hour and earned every dollar. He would survive into the 1980s, would die in Miami of natural causes, would take secrets to his grave that prosecutors had spent decades trying to uncover and never would. Lucky Luciano had died in 1962. Naples. Heart attack at the airport. Waiting for a film producer who wanted to make a movie about his life. Which would have been ironic if irony mattered in a world where the only thing that mattered was whether you died rich and free or poor and incarcerated. He died rich and free. The structure he'd built outlived him by decades, still operates today in modified form, adapted to new markets and new technologies, but following the same basic principles he'd established when he unified the families and replaced ethnic feuds with organizational hierarchy. Stephanie Saint. Claire had withdrawn completely by the early 1960s, took her money and her reputation, and stepped away from the life while she still could. While she was still healthy enough to enjoy retirement and smart enough to know that staying too long was how you ended up in courtrooms or caskets. She lived quietly, died quietly, left behind a legacy that most people don't know about because her success depended on invisibility. And invisibility doesn't generate headlines or history books or the kind of recognition that gets your name remembered 50 years later. Harlem continued operating on the model Bumpy had established. Decentralized, compartmentalized, money flowing through channels that shifted and adapted but never stopped completely, because the demand never stopped. And where there's demand, there's supply. And where there's supply, there's people willing to facilitate the connection between the two, for a percentage that adds up to more money than most people see in a lifetime. The numbers game eventually got absorbed by state lotteries, which was either progress or just legitimization of the same impulse that had been feeding Harlem's economy for decades, depending on whether you believed that government sanction made gambling moral or just made it legal. Either way, the money still moved. The percentages still got calculated. The envelopes still got delivered, just to different people through different channels with different levels of taxation. The old order, where one man believed fear was sufficient currency, had ended in a barber shop in 1957. The new order, where information determined who survived and who didn't, had established itself through patience and calculation and the understanding that real power doesn't announce itself. Doesn't need to. Just operates quietly in the background, making sure the machinery keeps running and the percentages keep adding up, and the people who matter keep getting paid. Nobody claimed victory. Nobody took credit. Nobody wrote memoirs that explained exactly how it happened, because explaining how it happened would require admitting participation in things that remained illegal, regardless of how much time had passed. The statute of limitations on murder doesn't expire. Neither does the obligation to stay quiet about murders you weren't officially involved in, but definitely benefited from. There's only one truth left standing when you strip away the legend and the mythology and the stories that got better with each telling. In that world, you could choose silence, or you could choose to become the reason other people had to act. Silence meant survival. Noise meant correction, and correction, when it came from an organization with resources and reach and absolutely no tolerance for members who couldn't follow rules. Looked like what happened to Anastasia. Quick, final, already forgotten by everyone except the people who had to clean up afterward. So here's the question, and it's the only question that matters if you ever find yourself in a world where normal rules don't apply and survival requires understanding rules nobody writes down. When power concentrates, when violence becomes currency, when the choice is between being quiet and being heard, between patience and action, between making powerful people think you're useful or making them think you're expensive, what do you choose? Because the choice you make determines whether you're Bumpy Johnson, dying of natural causes at 62, or Anastasia, dying in a barber chair at 55. And in that world, natural causes at 62 counts as winning. So here's the question nobody wants to answer. If someone took 3 of your people, what would you choose, the gun-fast final, forgotten by Friday, or the long game years of watching them become the problem everyone else solves, carrying the weight until the weight becomes unbearable? Bumpy Johnson chose patience, chose information, chose a kind of violence that didn't announce itself, but spread like poison through every connection that mattered. Was it justice, revenge, or just cold mathematics? History doesn't care. It only remembers who was still standing when the smoke cleared. Some men pay in bullets, some in time. And the ones who pay in time, they're the ones who teach lessons that last generations. If you want to understand real power, you just watched it. Silent, patient, inevitable. Subscribe if you're ready for more.